Everyone thought she came to watch a wedding, but she came to end one. The roar of a jet engine rolled across the private airfield like distant thunder, low and controlled, the kind of sound that made people stop mid-sentence and look up without knowing why. And as the wheels touched down against the runway, smooth and deliberate, a line of black SUVs idled nearby, engines humming in quiet anticipation, drivers standing straighter than usual. As if they already knew this arrival mattered more than any other that morning, and when the aircraft door finally opened, it didn't rush, it didn't reveal anything too quickly, it lingered, just long enough to let curiosity tighten in the air, because moments like this were never about speed, they were about impact, and then she appeared, Rebecca Hartwell, framed by sunlight and polished metal, one hand steady on the railing, the other holding onto a small child, while another stood just behind her, both children quiet, composed in a way that didn't belong to their age, dressed in soft neutral colors that whispered wealth without needing to announce it, and for a second, just a second, no one moved, because nothing about her matched the story people thought they knew, not the woman who had been left behind, not the woman who had once stood in a cramped apartment counting every dollar, not the woman who received an invitation printed on thick cream paper that felt heavier than it should have. As if the weight of it came from something deeper than cardstock, something sharper, something intentional, and somewhere across the city, in a ballroom filled with white roses and crystal chandeliers, Garrett Sullivan adjusted his cufflinks with a practiced smile, the kind that photographers loved and guests trusted, leaning slightly toward his best man as he murmured, "She won't come," with a confidence that sounded rehearsed, as if he had said it more than once, as if he needed it to be true. And around him, laughter flowed easily, glasses clinked, conversations layered over one another in that effortless rhythm of celebration, but beneath it all was a subtle expectation, a question no one said out loud but everyone had heard about, the ex-wife, the one who disappeared, the one who was supposed to be struggling, the one who had been invited, and back at the airfield, Rebecca stepped down onto solid ground, her heels making the faintest sound against the pavement, controlled, measured, each step landing with intention, and she didn't look rushed, didn't look nervous, didn't look like someone walking into a place where she didn't belong, because she wasn't arriving to fit into their story anymore, she was arriving to rewrite it, and as one of the children tilted their heads slightly and asked in a soft voice, "Mom, is he going to recognize us?" She didn't answer right away, her gaze fixed forward, steady, almost unreadable. Because recognition was never the question, the truth was, he had already seen them before, he just didn't know it yet, and as the convoy doors opened in perfect sequence, and the engines began to move in quiet unison, the distance between past and present collapsed into something dangerously small, because 18 months ago, everything had changed, and today, it was finally going to be seen. The ballroom lights glowed warm against polished marble floors, reflecting a version of perfection that had been carefully staged down to the smallest detail, and Garrett Sullivan stood at the center of it all, shaking hands, accepting congratulations, playing the role he had perfected over the past 4 years, the man who had moved on, the man who had built something better, stronger, more refined. And yet every few minutes his eyes drifted toward the entrance without realizing it, a subtle break in rhythm that only someone watching closely would notice, because confidence like his was never supposed to check the door twice, and across the room Tessa Brightwell adjusted the delicate bracelet on her wrist, her smile flawless, her posture effortless, leaning slightly into conversations that circled around her like orbiting satellites. But even she could feel it, that faint shift in the atmosphere. The kind that arrived before something changed, and near the back, a group of guests whispered quietly, their voices low but sharp with curiosity, because invitations like that were never innocent, because everyone knew about Rebecca, the ex-wife who had disappeared from the narrative as if she had never belonged there at all, the woman people described with polite words that meant something else entirely, quiet, simple, unfortunate, and as a server passed by carrying a tray of champagne, one guest leaned in and murmured, "Do you think she will actually show up?" And the answer came with a soft laugh. "People like her do not walk into rooms like this." And the statement settled into the air like fact, like something already decided. But outside, miles away just minutes earlier, Rebecca had been sitting in the back of the SUV, the city unfolding through tinted glass in a blur of steel and sunlight, her reflection faint against the window, steady, composed, almost unfamiliar even to herself, because this version of her did not exist 4 years ago. Not when she sat alone at a kitchen counter, staring at a single envelope, her hands still, her coffee gone cold, reading the same line over and over again as if repetition might change its meaning. No hard feelings. And she remembered how quiet the apartment had felt that day, the kind of quiet that pressed in from all sides, where even the smallest sounds seemed louder than they should be, the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock, the soft rustle of paper as she turned the invitation in her hands, and she remembered. Thinking how strange it was that something so small could carry so much weight, because it was never just an invitation, it was a message, a reminder of where she stood in his story, and where she no longer did. And in that moment she had almost decided not to go, almost convinced herself that silence would be easier, that distance would be safer. That letting him have his version of the ending would cost less than reopening everything she had worked so hard to rebuild. But then her phone had lit up on the table, a single name appearing on the screen, Julian, and she had stared at it longer than she wanted to admit, because 18 months earlier she had not been looking for anything, not for help, not for change, not for someone new, but sometimes change did not ask for permission, sometimes it arrived quietly, without announcement, and rewrote everything before you realized what was happening. And now as the SUV slowed and the city gave way to the long private drive leading toward the estate, Rebecca shifted slightly in her seat, one hand reaching back instinctively, resting against the small shoulder beside her, grounding herself in something real, something undeniable. Because this was no longer about whether she belonged in that room, it was about what the room was about to learn. And inside the ballroom Garrett checked his watch for the 3rd time, his smile tightening just enough to notice, because absence was starting to feel different than expected, because certainty was beginning to crack, and without knowing why he felt it, the same shift in the air that everyone else had missed, the quiet arrival of something he had not prepared for. The convoy turned onto the final stretch of the private drive, gravel shifting softly beneath the tires as the estate came into view, a sprawling display of glass and stone that looked less like a home and more like a statement, and Rebecca watched it approach without any visible reaction, her expression calm in a way that came from something deeper than confidence, something earned, because there was a time when places like this had felt intimidating. When stepping into rooms filled with people who spoke in numbers and deals had made her feel smaller than she was, but that version of her had been left behind long before this day, long before the quiet turning point that began not with a dramatic moment, but with something almost forgettable, a coffee shop on an ordinary afternoon, a crowded line, a distracted step, and the sudden spill of hot coffee across a laptop that did not belong to her. And she remembered the way her heart had jumped, the immediate apology, the expectation of frustration or annoyance, but instead there had been a pause, then a small, unexpected laugh, the kind that shifted the entire moment, and when she looked up she saw him, Julian Cross, not as the world would later describe him, not as a billionaire, not as a name attached to companies and headlines, but simply as a man who did not react the way she expected, who did not measure her worth by the mistake she had just made, and for a while that was all he was, someone who listened without interrupting, someone who asked questions and actually waited for answers, someone who never once made her feel like she needed to prove anything, and it was only later, much later, that the other details revealed themselves in fragments, a conversation cut short by a phone call that shifted his tone, a passing comment from someone who recognized him, a name mentioned with a level of respect that did not match the quiet person she had come to know, and even then he never led with it, never used it, never placed it between them like a barrier, and that was what made the difference, that was what made her stay, not the wealth, not the power, but the absence of it in the way he treated her. And now as the SUV slowed to a stop just beyond the entrance, the engine settling into silence, Rebecca exhaled slowly, not out of nerves, but out of recognition, because this was the moment where past and present would finally meet, and beside her one of the children shifted slightly, small fingers tightening around the edge of the seat, not afraid, just aware, and she reached for their hand without looking, a quiet reassurance that did not need words, because everything they needed to know was already understood, and inside the ballroom the music swelled gently as guests began to take their seats, the ceremony minutes away from beginning. The officiant preparing notes, the photographer adjusting angles, and Garrett stood at the front, posture perfect, gaze forward, but something in him refused to settle, a subtle tension he could not explain, as if the version of events he had constructed was beginning to slip, and as the coordinator leaned in to confirm timing, he nodded automatically, his attention already drifting again toward the entrance, because somewhere beneath the surface, beyond logic, beyond certainty, a single thought had begun to form, quiet but persistent: what if she did come? And outside, the car door opened with a soft, deliberate click, the kind of sound that does not demand attention, but somehow commands it anyway. The door opened fully and Rebecca stepped out into the late afternoon light, the soft breeze catching the edge of her coat as if the world itself paused to acknowledge the moment, and for a second everything felt suspended, the distant sound of music from inside the estate barely reaching the driveway, the quiet presence of staff who suddenly did not know where to look, because arrivals like this were not scheduled, not expected, and certainly not ordinary, and she did not rush, did not hesitate, her heels meeting the ground with a calm, measured rhythm that carried no trace of the life she had once been confined to, and behind her the children followed naturally, not clinging, not uncertain, just present, in a way that suggested they belonged wherever she stood, and one of the attendants instinctively moved forward then stopped, unsure whether to speak or simply observe, because there was something in the way she carried herself that made introductions feel unnecessary, and as the second vehicle door opened, a man stepped out on the opposite side, tall, composed, his presence quiet but unmistakable, Julian Cross, not announced, not introduced, but recognized in the subtle shift of posture from those who knew exactly who he was, and he did not step ahead of her, did not take control of the moment, he simply matched her pace, just half a step behind, as if the story unfolding here belonged to her alone, and together they moved toward the entrance, the distance closing with every step, while inside the ballroom the music softened as guests began to settle into their seats. The officiant offering a polite smile as he prepared to begin, and Garrett stood at the front, his expression steady but no longer effortless, because something had changed, something he could not yet see but could already feel, like the quiet pressure before a storm that never announces itself directly, and when the doors at the back of the room opened, it was not loud, not dramatic, just a simple movement that drew attention in the way only the unexpected can, and one by one heads turned, conversations paused mid-sentence. The natural rhythm of the room interrupted without explanation, and Rebecca stepped inside, not as a guest seeking permission, but as someone who had already decided she belonged there, her gaze steady, her posture unshaken, and for a moment no one spoke, because recognition moved slower than reality, because the image before them did not align with the story they had been told, and near the front Garrett's focus shifted, drawn instinctively toward the disturbance, his eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to correct what he was seeing, and then it settled, the realization landing not all at once but in fragments, first her face, then her presence, then the details that did not make sense, the children beside her, the man standing just behind, the quiet authority that surrounded them like something tangible, and the confidence he once associated with himself now reflected in someone he had already dismissed, and somewhere in the room a whisper began, low and uncertain, spreading from one guest to another, because people understood when something important was happening even if they did not yet know why, and Rebecca did not stop walking, did not look away, each step closing the space between past and present until there was no distance left at all, and in that moment Garrett understood something he had not prepared for, not a confrontation, not an argument, but something far more unsettling. The simple presence of truth, standing directly in front of him, waiting without urgency, without anger, without a single word, and for the first time since the day he sent that invitation, he was no longer certain of anything at all. No one announced her name, but it moved through the room anyway, carried in whispers that did not need volume to spread, "Rebecca, she is here," and the words traveled faster than logic, faster than explanation, because the image in front of them demanded attention in a way that could not be ignored, and Garrett felt it before he fully processed it, that subtle shift in control, the way the room no longer belonged to him. And for a brief moment he forced a smile, the kind built from habit rather than confidence, stepping forward as if proximity might restore order. "Rebecca," he said, her name unfamiliar on his tongue after years of absence, as if it belonged to a different life he had already closed, but she did not respond immediately, her gaze steady, measured, not avoiding him, not confronting him, simply acknowledging his presence without granting it weight, and that silence stretched longer than expected, long enough for discomfort to settle in places where certainty used to live. And behind her the children stood quietly, observing, their eyes moving across the room with a calm awareness that did not match their age, and one guest leaned toward another, voice barely above a whisper. "Are those—" But the sentence never finished, because the answer was already forming in the spaces between what was seen and what was understood, and Tessa's smile faltered for the first time that afternoon, just slightly, just enough to reveal that something had shifted beyond her control. Her fingers tightening around the bouquet she held too carefully, as if perfection could still be maintained through effort alone, and Julian remained where he was, just behind Rebecca, not intervening, not speaking, his presence. Quiet but undeniable, the kind of presence that did not need introduction to be recognized, and Garrett's eyes flickered toward him, confusion replacing confidence as pieces began to rearrange themselves in ways he had not anticipated, because this was not part of the narrative he had constructed, not part of the outcome he had expected when he sent that invitation with its carefully chosen words. And Rebecca finally spoke, her voice calm, even, carrying across the room without force. "You asked me to come." And it was not a question, not an accusation, just a statement of fact that landed with more weight than anything louder could have achieved, and Garrett nodded reflexively, as if agreement might give him back some control. "I did not think you would," he replied, the honesty slipping out before he could reshape it, and for a moment something unspoken passed between them, not anger, not regret, but recognition, the acknowledgement of how far apart their realities had become. And Rebecca's hand rested lightly on the shoulder of one of the children, a small, deliberate gesture that drew attention without demanding it, and the room followed that movement instinctively, eyes shifting, questions forming, the air tightening with anticipation, because the story people believed was beginning to unravel, thread by thread, and Garrett noticed it, felt it. The way attention moved away from him, and towards something he did not fully understand, and for the first time he hesitated, not because he lacked words, but because he was no longer certain which ones would still work, and Rebecca met his gaze without hesitation, her expression composed, unchanged, as if she had already moved past the moment he was still trying to control, and in that quiet space between them, without raising her voice, without changing her tone, she said, "There are some things you should have known before today." And the sentence did not end, it lingered, incomplete, hanging in the air, like a door that had just been opened, waiting for what would come next. The room did not breathe, it held itself still as if even the smallest movement might disrupt whatever was about to happen, and Garrett felt that stillness settle around him in a way he could not control, his instincts searching for something familiar to anchor to, a script, a reaction, a way to redirect attention, but Rebecca did not give him that opportunity. She did not raise her voice, did not step closer. She simply reached into her bag with a calm precision that carried more authority than any confrontation ever could, and from it she pulled a thin folder, unremarkable in appearance, the kind of thing that would be overlooked in any other setting, but here, in this moment, it became the center of gravity for every eye in the room. And she held it for a second, not dramatically, not for effect, but as if acknowledging the weight it carried before placing it gently on a nearby table. The soft sound of paper meeting polished was somehow louder than it should have been, and Garrett's gaze dropped to it instinctively, confusion tightening his expression as he tried to anticipate what this could possibly be, because whatever it was, it did not fit into the version of events he had planned, and Rebecca spoke again, her tone unchanged, steady, controlled. "When we signed the divorce papers, you said everything was transparent." And the words were simple, almost conversational, but they landed with a precision that cut through the room, and Garrett straightened slightly, defensive reflex replacing uncertainty. "It was," he replied quickly, too quickly, as if speed could reinforce truth, and Rebecca did not argue, did not challenge him directly. She simply opened the folder, turning it toward him, and though the guests could not yet see what was inside, they leaned forward anyway, drawn by the shift in tension, by the quiet certainty in her movements, and Garrett stepped closer despite himself, his eyes scanning the documents, lines of numbers, account statements, property listings, all arranged with a clarity that left little room for interpretation, and for a moment his expression did not change, as if his mind refused to process what it was seeing, but then it did, slowly, unmistakably. And the color in his face shifted just enough to be noticed, just enough to confirm what no one else could yet read, and a murmur began to ripple through the room, subtle at first, then growing, because people recognized that look, the moment when control slips, when certainty fractures, when the narrative no longer holds, and Tessa's posture stiffened beside him, her earlier composure giving way to something more fragile, her eyes moving quickly between Garrett and the documents, searching for reassurance that did not come. And Rebecca did not rush the moment, she allowed it to unfold, allowed the silence to stretch just long enough for understanding to settle in, and then, without shifting her tone, without changing her pace, she added, "These accounts were never disclosed." And the sentence landed like a quiet verdict, not loud, not aggressive, but undeniable, and Garrett looked up at her then, not with the confidence he had carried moments before, but with something else, something closer to realization. Because this was no longer about perception, no longer about image, this was about fact, about records, about truth documented in ink and numbers that did not bend to explanation, and behind Rebecca, one of the children shifted slightly, their small voice breaking the tension in the simplest way possible. "Mom, is this why we came?" And she placed her hand gently on their shoulder again, grounding, steady, before answering softly, "Yes." And in that single word the entire room understood that. This moment was never about disruption, never about spectacle, it was about something far more precise, the correction of a story that had been told incorrectly for far too long, and Garrett stood there, the folder still open in front of him, the life he had constructed beginning to unravel not through force, but through the quiet, undeniable presence of what had always been there, waiting to be seen. The silence did not break all at once, it shifted, fractured into whispers that moved faster now, no longer cautious, no longer uncertain, because the presence of proof changed everything, and Garrett felt it slipping through his fingers, the control, the narrative, the version of himself he had built so carefully over the past 4 years. And he closed the folder halfway as if reducing its visibility might somehow reduce its impact. But the damage was already done, the numbers already seen, the implication already understood, and he exhaled slowly, forcing composure back into his posture. "This is not the place for this," he said, his voice measured, lower now, attempting to contain the moment, to shrink it back into something private, manageable. But Rebecca did not respond to the tone, she responded to the truth, her gaze steady, unshaken. "It became the place when you invited me," she replied, and the sentence landed clean, without aggression, without hesitation, and the room reacted not with noise but with attention. Because people understood what was happening, even if they did not yet know how far it would go, and Tessa stepped closer to Garrett then, her voice softer but edged with urgency. "Garrett, what is she talking about?" And he did not answer her immediately, his focus still locked on Rebecca as if trying to calculate the next move, the next line, the next way to regain ground, but there was no script for this, no prepared response for a truth that had already been documented, and Rebecca did not press forward, did not escalate, she simply allowed the moment to breathe, because she understood something he did not yet accept, that the power here did not come from volume, it came from clarity, and one of the guests, a man near the front who had been part of Garrett's business circle for years, leaned in just enough to see the edge of the documents still visible on the table, his expression shifting as recognition set in. Because numbers like those did not lie, and he stepped back slightly. The distance subtle but meaningful, and others followed in small ways, not physically stepping away, but emotionally recalibrating, reassessing the man they had come to celebrate, and Garrett noticed it, the shift in loyalty, the quiet retreat of certainty from the people around him, and that was when his voice changed, not louder, but sharper. "You could have handled this differently," he said, the words carrying an attempt at blame, at redirecting responsibility, but Rebecca did not accept it. Did not carry it, she simply tilted her head slightly, considering him for a brief second before answering. I tried. And those two words held more history than anything else spoken that day, because they were not about this moment, they were about every moment before it, every conversation that had not been heard, every truth that had been overlooked, every chance that had been given and ignored, and Garrett felt that weight even if he did not fully acknowledge it, because something in his expression softened, just for a second, just enough to reveal that recognition had begun, and behind Rebecca, the children remained still, watching, not confused, not afraid, simply present, as if they understood that what was happening was not chaos, it was correction, and Julian finally moved then, not stepping in front, not taking over, but placing a single document beside the folder, one page, clean, precise, and Garrett's eyes dropped to it instinctively, scanning quickly, and this time the reaction came faster, because this was not just about hidden accounts anymore, this was about confirmation, about connection, about something that reached beyond finances and into something far more personal, and the room felt it again, that tightening of air. That shift from curiosity to realization, because the story was not just changing, it was expanding, revealing layers no one had expected, and Rebecca watched him carefully, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with a calm certainty, because she had already lived through the hardest part, and this was simply the moment where everything else finally caught up. Garrett's eyes moved across the single page Julian had placed down, slower this time, more careful, as if his mind was trying to reject what it already understood, and the silence around him deepened, not empty but heavy, filled with the quiet awareness of every person in the room watching a truth unfold in real time, and he blinked once, then again, his jaw tightening as the words on the page settled into meaning, legal language. Dates, signatures, details that connected pieces he had never expected to see connected, and when he finally looked up, it was not at Rebecca first, but at the children, his gaze drawn there as if something instinctive had taken over, something deeper than logic, and for a moment the room seemed to narrow to just that line of sight, the distance between what he was seeing and what he was beginning to understand collapsing into something unavoidable. And Rebecca did not interrupt that realization, did not rush to explain, because she knew that some truths did not need to be spoken to be understood, they simply needed to be seen, and one of the children shifted slightly under his gaze, not uncomfortable, not afraid, just aware, their presence calm, steady, undeniable, and Garrett's voice when it came was quieter than before, stripped of the certainty it once carried. "That is not possible," he said, but the words lacked conviction, more reflex than belief, and Rebecca met his eyes without hesitation, her expression unchanged. "It is," she answered, and there was no emphasis, no push, just clarity, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than any argument could have, and a ripple moved through the guests again, different this time, no longer curiosity but realization, because the implications were impossible to ignore, and someone near the aisle whispered, "The timing," and another voice followed, "The divorce," piecing together fragments that now aligned in ways they had not before, and Tessa stepped back slightly, the movement small but noticeable, her grip on composure slipping as her gaze moved from Garrett to the children and back again, searching for something that would make this make sense, something that would restore the version of reality she had believed in just minutes ago, but there was nothing to hold on to, nothing to correct what was already clear, and Garrett shook his head once, as if rejecting the entire premise, but his eyes did not leave them, could not leave them, because recognition does not wait for acceptance, it arrives on its own terms, and Julian remained still, watching. Not intervening, not guiding, because this moment did not belong to him, it belonged to the truth that had finally reached its destination, and Rebecca took a small step forward then, not closing the distance aggressively, just enough to anchor the moment, and she spoke again, her voice as steady as it had been from the beginning. "You never asked?" And the sentence landed differently than the others, softer but sharper, because it pointed not to what had been hidden, but to what had been ignored, and Garrett's expression shifted again, something closer to realization breaking through, because he understood what she meant, not just the surface of it, but the depth, the years, the choices, the absence of questions that might have changed everything. And the room felt it, that shift from shock to understanding, because this was no longer just about documents or numbers or even the children standing quietly beside her. This was about a pattern. A series of decisions that had led directly to this moment, and for the first time since she walked in, Rebecca's gaze softened just slightly, not with forgiveness, not with regret, but with a quiet finality, because there was nothing left to prove, nothing left to reveal. Everything that needed to be seen was already there, and Garrett stood in front of it, no longer the man controlling the narrative, but the man facing it. The room no longer felt like a celebration, it felt like a place where something irreversible had already happened, even though no one had raised their voice, even though no one had made a scene, because the truth did not need volume to take control, it simply needed to be present, and Garrett stood there with that presence pressing in from all sides, the documents still open, the page still visible, the reality no longer something he could reshape or dismiss, and for a moment he said nothing. Not because he had nothing to say, but because every possible response felt smaller than the situation in front of him, and that silence stretched just long enough for the room to begin drawing its own conclusions, and people did, quietly, efficiently, the way they always do when power shifts without announcement, and one guest stepped slightly away from the front row, then another adjusted their posture, no longer leaning forward in admiration but sitting back in observation, recalculating, reassessing, and Tessa's expression changed again, the composure she had held on to now visibly strained, her eyes searching Garrett's face for something solid, something reassuring, but finding only hesitation, and that hesitation said more than any explanation could, because it confirmed what no one had yet spoken out loud, and Garrett finally exhaled, a slow breath that carried something unfamiliar, not authority, not control, but weight, and when he spoke again his voice was different, quieter, more measured. "Why now?" he asked, and the question was not defensive, not sharp, it was genuine in a way that revealed how little he understood the path that had led here, and Rebecca looked at him for a moment before answering, not immediately, not reactively, as if choosing words that did not need to be strong to be final. "Because this is the moment you chose," she said, and the answer did not accuse, did not blame, it simply reflected the reality of his own decision back to him, and Garrett's gaze dropped briefly, the meaning settling in, because he recognized it, the invitation, the timing, the assumption that she would either not come or arrive unchanged, and the realization that he had set this moment in motion himself landed quietly but completely, and behind Rebecca the children remained still, their presence now fully understood by everyone in the room, no longer a question, no longer a possibility, but a fact that reshaped everything around it. And one of them looked up at her again, their voice soft but clear. "Are we staying long?" And the simplicity of the question cut through the tension in a way nothing else had, grounding the moment in something real, something human, and Rebecca's expression softened just slightly as she answered, "Not much longer." And the words carried a calm certainty that signaled the end of something rather than the beginning, and Julian stepped forward just enough to stand beside her now, not leading, not taking over, but present in a way that confirmed what the room had already begun to understand, that this was not a return to the past, this was a transition beyond it, and Garrett looked at him then, really looked, seeing not just the man but what he represented, the life Rebecca had built without him, the stability, the presence, the quiet confidence that did not need to be announced, and something in Garrett's expression shifted again. Not into anger, not into denial, but into something closer to recognition, the kind that comes when a person finally sees the full cost of what they chose to leave behind, and the room held that moment with a kind of collective stillness, because everyone could feel it, the ending that did not require words, the conclusion that had already been reached, and Rebecca did not wait for anything further, did not seek acknowledgement or apology, she simply turned slightly, her hand guiding the children with a gentle, practiced motion, and began to walk away, not quickly, not dramatically, just steadily, as if leaving was always the final step, and this time, no one tried to stop her. Rebecca did not look back as she walked, not because she was avoiding anything, but because there was nothing left behind that needed her attention, and the sound of her steps across the polished floor was steady, unhurried, each one carrying the quiet certainty of a chapter already closed, and beside her the children followed naturally, their small hands brushing against hers in a rhythm that felt practiced, familiar. As if they had always known how to move forward without hesitation, and Julian remained just within reach, his presence constant but unobtrusive, allowing the moment to belong entirely to her, and behind them the room remained suspended in that strange stillness that follows a realization too large to process immediately, no one rushing to speak, no one attempting to restore what had just been undone, because some moments do not allow for recovery. They simply redefine everything that comes after, and Garrett stood where she had left him, the documents still resting on the table, the words still visible, the implications still unfolding in his mind in waves he could not control, and for the first time that day he did not try to stop her, did not call her name. Because something in him understood that there was no version of this where she would turn around, no sentence that could bring the moment back under his control, and that understanding settled in quietly, heavier than anything else that had happened, and around him the guests began to shift, not dramatically, not all at once, but in small, telling ways, conversations restarting in lower tones, glances exchanged that carried more meaning than words. And one by one the focus of the room moved away from him, not with confrontation, not with accusation, but with something more final, distance, and Tessa stood still for a moment longer before lowering her gaze, the image she had been holding on to no longer aligning with the reality in front of her, her posture no longer effortless, her confidence no longer untouched, because what had just been revealed did not leave room for illusion, and Garrett noticed all of it, the subtle shifts, the recalculations, the way the room no longer responded to him the way it had just minutes ago, and it was not loud, not immediate, but it was undeniable, and outside the doors the air felt different, lighter. As Rebecca stepped into the open space beyond the ballroom, the distant hum of the city returning, grounding the moment in something real again, and she paused briefly, not out of hesitation, but to let the transition settle, to allow herself a single breath that carried none of the weight she had once carried into rooms like that. And one of the children looked up at her, their voice soft but certain, "Is it over?" And she smiled, just slightly, a quiet expression that did not need to be explained. "Yes," she said, and in that word there was no anger, no triumph, just resolution, and Julian opened the car door without speaking, the gesture simple, respectful, and as they moved toward it the world continued as it always does, indifferent to individual moments but shaped by them nonetheless, and Rebecca took one last step before entering, her gaze forward, her posture unchanged, and somewhere behind her, inside a room filled with people who had just witnessed something they would not forget, Garrett finally understood what had truly happened, not in the documents, not in the whispers, but in the silence she left behind. Because some endings do not arrive with noise, they arrive with absence, and by the time you recognize them, they have already taken everything that mattered with them. The car door closed with a soft, final sound that seemed to seal the moment behind her. And as the vehicle pulled away from the estate, the reflection of the building faded across the tinted glass until it disappeared completely, leaving only the quiet movement of the road ahead, and Rebecca sat back slightly, her posture no longer held by purpose but by release, the kind that comes after something long carried has finally been set down. And for a few seconds no one spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because silence felt more accurate than any words could be. And beside her one of the children leaned gently against her arm, their voice soft, almost thoughtful. He looked different. And Rebecca glanced down at them, not surprised by the observation, because children notice what adults often overlook, the small changes, the subtle shifts, the truth behind expressions, and she nodded once. "Sometimes people do when they finally see something clearly," she replied, her tone calm, not teaching, not correcting, just acknowledging, and across from her Julian watched quietly, his expression steady, not searching for validation, not asking for explanation, because he understood that this moment did not need to be analyzed, it needed to be felt, and after a brief pause he spoke, his voice low and even. "You did not have to say much." And Rebecca allowed herself a small breath that almost resembled a smile. "I did not need to," she answered, and that was the truth of it. Because everything that mattered had already been said long before she walked into that room, it had just never been heard, and now that it had, there was nothing left to add, and the city moved around them as the car merged into traffic. Ordinary life continuing without pause, people crossing streets, lights changing, conversations happening in places untouched by what had just occurred, and yet for Rebecca, something fundamental had shifted, not in the world, but in her place within it. Because she was no longer defined by what had happened to her, she was defined by what she had chosen to do with it, and behind them, back at the estate, the room that had once been filled with celebration was still trying to find its footing, conversations quieter now, laughter absent, the carefully constructed atmosphere unable to return to what it had been, because once a truth enters a space like that, it does not leave, it lingers, reshaping perception in ways that cannot be undone, and Garrett remained where he had been, though the room had begun to move around him again, his gaze no longer fixed on the door, but on something internal, something he could not step away from. Because what he had seen was not just a moment, it was a reflection of choices, of things left unexamined, of assumptions made without question, and that realization settled deeper with every passing second, and outside, miles away now, Rebecca reached forward slightly, adjusting the sleeve of one of the children, a small, familiar gesture that brought everything back to something simple, something real, and the child looked up at her with quiet certainty. "We are going home, right?" And this time her answer came without pause, without wait, just truth. "Yes." And as the car continued forward, the road stretching out ahead without interruption, it became clear that what she had left behind was not something she had lost, it was something she had outgrown, and for the first time in a long time, there was nothing behind her calling her back. The city lights stretched into long reflections across the car window as evening settled in, the soft glow of street lamps and passing headlights blending into something calm, something steady, and Rebecca watched it without really focusing on any single point, because for the first time in a long while her mind was not racing ahead or looking back, it was simply present, and that quiet presence felt unfamiliar at first, almost weightless. As if she had been carrying something for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to move without it, and beside her the children had relaxed into their seats, one leaning slightly against the door, the other tracing invisible patterns on the fabric with small, absent movements, the kind that come when a moment has passed but its meaning is still settling, and Julian glanced toward her briefly before returning his attention forward, not intruding on the silence, not filling it, because he understood that some moments needed space more than conversation. And after a few seconds Rebecca spoke, not to break the silence, but to acknowledge it. "I thought it would feel different," she said quietly, and Julian turned his head slightly, his voice even. "Different how?" And she considered the question, not rushing to answer, her gaze still resting on the moving lights outside. "Heavier maybe," she said. "Or louder." And there was a faint trace of reflection in her tone, not regret, not doubt, just observation, and Julian nodded once, understanding more from what she did not say than what she did. "Sometimes the moments we build up the most end quietly," he replied, and she let that settle, because it matched what she felt, the absence of drama, the absence of anything unresolved, and in that absence there was something unexpected, clarity, and one of the children shifted again, looking up at her with a thoughtful expression. "Are we going to see him again?" And the question lingered for a second, not complicated, not layered, just honest, and Rebecca turned slightly toward them, her voice calm and certain. "Not like before," she said, and that answer was enough, because it did not promise more than it should, and it did not carry anything it did not need, and the child nodded, satisfied, returning to their quiet observation of the world outside, and the car continued forward, moving through the city in a steady rhythm that felt almost symbolic, not rushing, not stopping, just continuing, and Rebecca let her hand rest lightly over theirs, a small, grounding gesture that required no explanation, and in that moment, she understood something clearly, not about Garrett, not about what had happened, but about herself, about the way she had once measured her life against what she had lost, and how that measure no longer applied, because what she had now was not built in response to him, it was built in spite of him, independently, intentionally, and that difference mattered more than anything that had been revealed. Earlier that day, and somewhere behind them, far enough away now that it felt like a different place entirely, the consequences of that revelation were still unfolding, still being discussed, still being processed. But here, in this quiet moving space, none of that reached her, none of it needed to, because she was no longer part of that story, and as the car turned onto a quieter street, the noise of the city softening into something more distant, more contained, Rebecca allowed herself a slow breath, not out of relief, but out of recognition, because this was what moving on actually felt like, not dramatic, not loud, just steady, and for the first time she did not need to look back to understand where she had been, she only needed to look forward to know where she was going. The car slowed as it turned into a quiet driveway lined with soft garden lights, the kind that did not demand attention but created a sense of arrival, and as the vehicle came to a smooth stop, the engine settling into silence, Rebecca did not move immediately, not out of hesitation, but because there was no urgency left in her, no pressure to reach the next moment before she was ready. And for a few seconds she simply sat there, her hands still resting gently over the children's, the faint reflection of the house ahead visible in the window, warm lights glowing through large windows, steady and welcoming, and it felt different from the place she had left, not larger, not more impressive, but real in a way that did not rely on appearance, and one of the children leaned forward slightly, peering out with quiet curiosity. "This is home," they said softly, not asking, just recognizing, and Rebecca nodded, her voice calm, certain. "Yes." And that word carried something deeper now. Something that had taken time to build, something that had not existed before everything fell apart years ago, and Julian stepped out first, walking around to open the door, the gesture simple, consistent with everything he had done from the beginning, never drawing attention to himself, never taking more space than he needed, and as Rebecca stepped out, the cool evening air brushed lightly against her, grounding her fully in the present. And she paused just for a moment, not to look back, but to feel forward, to recognize the difference between where she had been and where she was standing now, and behind her the children followed, their steps light, unburdened, moving toward the house without hesitation, because to them this was not a transition, it was simply life, and as they reached the door, one of them turned back briefly, not toward the past, but toward her, their expression open, uncomplicated. "Are we okay?" And Rebecca met their eyes, and for the first time there was no trace of anything unresolved in her answer, no weight, no hesitation, just truth. "We are more than okay," she said, and the words settled naturally, not as reassurance, but as fact, and Julian watched her for a moment, not with curiosity, not with expectation, but with quiet understanding, because he had seen the distance she had traveled, not in miles, not in time, but in something far less visible and far more important, and as they stepped inside, the door closing softly behind them, the outside world remained where it was, unchanged, continuing its rhythm without interruption, but inside, something had fully shifted, something had reached its end and its beginning at the same time, and far away, in a room that was still trying to recover from a moment it could not undo, Garrett remained standing in the place where everything had changed, the echo of her presence still lingering in ways he could not ignore, and for the first time, without distraction, without control, without the version of the story he had always told himself, he understood what had been lost, not in the documents, not in the whispers, but in the quiet strength of the woman who had walked away without needing anything from him at all, and that understanding did not come with noise, it did not demand attention, it simply settled in, permanent. And as the night moved forward and the world continued without pause, one truth remained, clear and unspoken. Some people do not need to take anything back to win, they only need to stop giving what was never valued, and in that silence, the lesson was finally learned.